morning, lovelies. Today we're going to ask and answer the question, what is the difference between high fantasy or epic fantasy and urban fantasy? It may seem a bit nitpicky to make an entire video dedicated to defining what are basically just two different flavors of fantasy, but it is important to determine genres and subgenres. High fantasy and urban fantasy are very distinct. They both have different aesthetics and, more importantly, different tropes that readers are going to expect avoided when they pick up your story. So what is high fantasy? Well, if you've seen any of my other What's the Difference videos, you probably already know the answer to this question because I never shut up about it. It is my favorite genre. High fantasy, sometimes called epic fantasy, is a subgenre within fantasy that takes place on a totally different make-believe world. All the cities, countries, and continents are completely made up. Lord of the Rings pretty much defined this genre with the whole quest and the elves and the dwarves and the orcs and the Dark Lord and all that jazz, and Game of Thrones mainstreamed the subversion of all of these tropes. Actually, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones are more like two different subgenres within the high fantasy subgenre. I mean, high fantasy is so vast that at this point it's more of a setting than an actual genre. You can have any type of high fantasy story. A children's story, a grimdark story, a love story, whatever. But generally speaking, if you are writing an epic fantasy story, the readers are going to expect certain things to pop up, like some sort of adventure or quest, royalty, magic, maybe even a Dark Lord or two. Urban fantasy is very similar. It's more of a setting than a genre. It can tell any type of story, but it's almost always going to be romance or have some sort of romantic subplot that takes up most of the story. Romantic subplots are extremely common anyways, but with the exception of The Trials of Apollo, which came after Heroes of Olympus and Percy Jackson, which did include romantic subplots, I don't think I have ever even heard of an urban fantasy story that did not include romance in some way, which is probably why I steer clear of the genre. Urban fantasy is when you have a fantasy story that takes place on Earth, specifically an Earth city. You have witches and wizards running around New York City or werewolf hunters in Los Angeles. It's a subgenre of low fantasy, which I talked about in an earlier video. Low fantasy is when a fantasy story takes place anywhere on Earth, whereas urban fantasy is more, well, urban. Low fantasy can take place in a barn, whereas urban fantasy has to take place in some sort of city at some point. Most urban fantasy stories take place in the modern day, like Percy Jackson, which I already mentioned. But other urban fantasy stories explicitly take place in the past, combining it with historical fiction, like Libba Bray's The Diviners series, which is about these people with psychic powers in 1920s New York. Sometimes, in urban fantasy, the magical elements are incredibly common and everyone knows about them, kinda like in epic fantasy. But most of the time, urban fantasy utilizes the secret otherworld, which is where all of the magical elements are hidden from normal people for whatever reason. And the protagonists usually have to protect the normal world from the more dangerous aspects of the secret otherworld, usually without getting caught by the people of the normal world in the process. There is something of a middle ground. Sometimes you have the character start in a regular Earth city and then they'll end up transported to this epic fantasy world and spend most of the story there, or they'll go back and forth. I mean, there's some debate on that. Personally, I think if you have a Narnia situation where the characters are spending like 90% of the story in that epic fantasy world and all of the magical elements are restrained to that world, you've got epic fantasy. But if the magic is bleeding over in the regular world and or the villain spends the third act trashing New York City or Tokyo or whatever, and that's where the big battle happens, it's probably close to urban fantasy. But that is the difference between high and urban fantasy. Please tell me which genre you prefer in the comments and why, and I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies!